Out on the lonely, endless stretches of the American interstate, the darkness has a way of playing tricks on the mind. The hypnotic hum of the tires against wet asphalt becomes a lullaby, and the shadows just beyond the reach of your headlights seem to stretch out, inviting you into the unknown. Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Tonight, we are riding shotgun into the abyss. In our modern age of trucking, every single mile, every ounce of freight, and every rest stop is meticulously tracked, monitored, and recorded by satellites in the sky. You cannot hide a 53-foot rig. But what happens when the digital world goes dark? What happens when a veteran driver is handed a cold, archaic paper manifest and paid a small fortune to haul an impossible pulsing cargo completely off the grid? What happens when the destination is a facility that the federal government wiped from the map decades ago, and the man signing for the delivery has been dead for 36 years? Before we put this rig in gear and head down that dark, forgotten mountain highway, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Tell me about the strangest, most unexplainable thing you've ever seen on a late night drive. It feeds the algorithm, helps our community grow, and keeps our headlights burning through the dark. So, lock your doors, turn up the radio, and brace yourselves. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The midnight run that broke reality. In the highly regulated world of modern long-haul trucking, there is one universal truth. If it is not on the manifest, it does not exist. The manifest is the holy grail of logistics. It is a legally binding document that details exactly what a driver is hauling, how much it weighs, where it originated, and who is legally responsible for receiving it at the final destination. In today's industry, this paperwork is almost entirely digital. It is tracked by GPS, verified by electronic logging devices, and monitored by dispatchers in real time from hundreds of miles away. You cannot simply move a massive piece of freight across state lines without a massive digital footprint following right behind it. But on a bitter, freezing night in late autumn, a veteran female truck driver experienced an event that completely shattered that reality. She was handed a physical manifest, hauled a tremendously heavy, physically impossible load across treacherous mountain passes, and delivered it to a facility that, according to every official record, had been wiped off the face of the earth decades prior. To understand how utterly terrifying and inexplicable this event was, you first have to understand the driver at the center of it. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. By the time November of 2018 rolled around, Sarah was not a rookie who could easily get spooked by the shadows on the highway. She was a 42-year-old owner-operator with over 1.5 million safe driving miles under her belt. She drove a pristine, slate gray 2014 Freightliner Cascadia, a massive, powerful machine that she maintained with obsessive, almost religious dedication. Sarah was known throughout the terminal at Apex Logistics, the freight brokerage she contracted with out of Louisville, Kentucky, as the driver you called when you had a difficult, high-stakes run that absolutely had to be made in the dead of night. She preferred the graveyard shift. She loved the empty roads, the quiet hum of the massive diesel engine, and the solitude of the American interstate system while the rest of the country slept. It was the evening of November 13th, 2018. Sarah was originally scheduled to be off-duty. She was parked at a sprawling, brightly lit truck stop on the industrial outskirts of Memphis, Tennessee, settling into the sleeper cab of her Freightliner to get some much-needed rest after a grueling 3-day run from Texas. The weather outside was miserable. A freezing, relentless drizzle was falling, coating the expansive asphalt parking lot in a thin, dangerous sheen of black ice. Just as she was pulling the heavy blackout curtains across her windshield to block out the harsh amber glow of the parking lot lights, her cell phone rang. She looked at the caller ID. It was Ryan Daniels, the senior night dispatcher for Apex Logistics. Ryan was a seasoned logistical veteran, a man who rarely sounded stressed and who intimately knew the strict federal regulations regarding how many hours a driver was legally allowed to work. Sarah answered the phone, fully expecting Ryan to ask if she could take a load first thing in the morning. Instead, his voice sounded tight, uncharacteristically rushed, and unusually quiet, He told Sarah that he had a massive problem and he desperately needed a favor. A premium client had a specialized, highly sensitive piece of industrial equipment that absolutely had to be moved out of Memphis that very night, with a guaranteed delivery in the Appalachian foothills of North Carolina before dawn. Ryan explained that the original driver assigned to the load had simply abandoned his truck at the loading dock and quit, refusing to answer his phone. Sarah immediately pushed back. She reminded Ryan that she was out of hours. Her electronic logging device, or ELD, which tracks every minute a truck is in motion, would flag her for a severe federal violation if she fired up her rig and took off. Ryan told her something that made her pause. He said this load was entirely off the digital grid. It was an old school, strictly paper transaction. He told her to log herself out of the ELD entirely, effectively turning off her truck's digital tracking system and run the load using a physical paper logbook, a practice that was largely illegal and outdated, reserved only for extreme emergencies or highly classified government transport. To sweeten the deal, Ryan offered her an astronomical sum of money, triple the usual rate for a run of that distance, paid directly to her company account by morning. Against her better judgment, the veteran instinct in Sarah, coupled with the undeniable appeal of the massive payout, won out. She agreed. Ryan gave her an address for a warehouse in a heavily decayed, largely abandoned industrial sector of North Carolina. When Sarah fired up the Freightliner and pulled out of the truck stop, the clock on her dashboard read 11:45 in the evening. The address Ryan had provided led Sarah deep into a forgotten, crumbling district of Memphis that sat right against the swollen banks of the Mississippi River. The streets were narrow, potholed, and lined with the skeletal remains of long-defunct manufacturing plants. No streetlights were functioning in this sector, and the heavy freezing rain made visibility dangerously low. Eventually, her headlights swept across a rusted chain-link fence and a faded sign that read Sector 4B, Specialized Transit. Sarah pulled her massive rig through the open gates and backed her empty 53-foot trailer up to the only loading dock that had a light on a single, flickering, pale yellow bulb that cast long, eerie shadows across the concrete. As soon as she set her parking brake, the heavy metal door on the loading dock rolled up with a deafening, metallic screech. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had not seen the sun in years. He was rail-thin, with deeply sunken eyes and skin that was pale to the point of looking almost translucent. He wore a heavy, faded, green canvas jacket that looked completely soaked through with rain. Sarah climbed down from her warm cab, pulling her collar up against the biting wind, and walked up the metal stairs to the dock. She introduced herself. The man simply stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking. His voice was raspy, barely above a whisper. He introduced himself as Jacob. Jacob did not ask for her commercial driver's license. He did not ask to verify her company DOT number. He simply turned around and gestured toward the center of the massive, otherwise completely empty warehouse. Sitting alone in the center of the concrete floor was a single, solitary crate. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever hauled in her decade on the road. It was roughly the size of a small minivan, constructed entirely of thick, dark, heavy-gauge steel. There were no wooden pallets beneath it, no company logos stamped on the sides, no warning labels, and no shipping codes. It was just a massive, brutal block of dark metal. Heavy steel chains were wrapped tightly around its circumference, securing it to thick, industrial D-rings welded to a heavy steel base plate. Sarah asked Jacob what was inside. Jacob slowly turned to her, his sunken eyes completely devoid of emotion, and said, "Machinery. It needs to be in North Carolina by dawn. That is all you need to know." Jacob walked over to a small, dusty wooden desk near the dock door and picked up a piece of paper. He handed it to Sarah. It was the manifest. But just like everything else about this job, it was wrong. It wasn't a standard computer printout. It was a thick, old-fashioned carbon copy manifest, the kind that had not been widely used in the industry since the late 1990s. The text on the paper had been struck by a manual typewriter, the black ink slightly smudged and pressed deep into the heavy paper stock. The manifest listed the origin simply as Memphis Depot. The destination was listed as Blackwood Processing Facility, located off an unmarked county road deep in the mountains outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The weight of the cargo was typed out as exactly 12,000 pounds. 12,000 pounds is a moderately heavy load, but it is nothing a 500 horsepower Freightliner Cascadia couldn't easily handle. Sarah signed her name on the bottom line, keeping the pink carbon copy for her own records, and walked back to her truck to prepare for loading. Jacob climbed onto a massive, heavy-duty industrial forklift. The machine roared to life, billowing thick, black diesel smoke into the enclosed warehouse. As Jacob drove the forks under the steel crate and began to lift it, something incredibly strange happened. The massive forklift, a machine designed to easily lift upwards of 30,000 pounds, groaned violently. The rear wheels of the forklift actually lifted off the ground for a terrifying second, teetering on the brink of tipping forward, before slamming heavily back down onto the concrete. The engine whined and struggled, RPM screaming, just to lift this seemingly 12,000-pound crate a few inches off the floor. Sarah watched, her stomach tightening into a knot. She knew instantly that the manifest was a lie. That crate did not weigh 12,000 pounds. Based on how that industrial forklift was struggling, that steel box weighed at least 35 to 40,000 pounds, perhaps even more. Jacob slowly, painstakingly drove the heavy crate into the back of Sarah's trailer, dropping it aggressively right over the trailer's rear axles. The moment the steel base plate made contact with the wooden floor of her trailer, Sarah's entire massive truck violently shuddered. The heavy air suspension on her tractor and trailer hissed loudly, struggling to compensate for the sudden, immense, and highly concentrated weight. Sarah immediately climbed into the back of the dark trailer with her heavy-duty ratcheting load straps. She threw 4 thick straps over the top of the steel crate, cranking them down with all her strength to secure it to the floor rails. As she leaned her hands against the cold steel of the crate to tighten the final strap, she froze. The crate was vibrating. It wasn't a mechanical vibration, like an engine running or a generator humming. It was a deep, low-frequency, rhythmic pulse. It felt almost organic. It felt like a massive, slow heartbeat pounding against the thick steel walls from the inside. The vibration was so deep, it traveled through the cold metal, up through Sarah's arms, and rattled deep in her chest cavity. She quickly pulled her hands away, stepping back toward the open doors of the trailer. She looked out at the loading dock. Jacob was already rolling the heavy metal door down. He didn't wave. He didn't look back. The door slammed shut with a final echoing boom, leaving Sarah alone in the freezing rain with a deeply unsettling, pulsing box of steel in her trailer. Sarah secured her trailer doors, climbed into the warm, familiar sanctuary of her cab, and locked her doors. She placed the heavy carbon copy manifest on her passenger seat. She put the truck in gear and slowly rolled out of the decaying industrial park, merging onto Interstate 40 East. The time was exactly 12:30 in the morning of November 14th, 2018. The first hour of the drive was intensely stressful, but manageable. However, as Sarah put the city lights of Memphis behind her and plunged into the pitch-black, deeply isolated stretches of highway heading toward Nashville, the reality of what she was hauling began to aggressively assert itself. The truck was handling terribly. Even though the crate was supposedly secured directly over her rear trailer axles, the weight felt completely wrong. It felt dynamic. It felt as though the immense weight inside the crate was shifting back and forth on its own. Every time Sarah took a gentle curve in the highway, the trailer would aggressively pull against her fifth wheel, the massive metal coupling that connects the trailer to the truck, forcing her to fight the steering wheel just to keep the rig in her lane. But far worse than the shifting weight was the vibration. By the time she passed Nashville and began the long, dark climb toward Knoxville, the low-frequency pulse she had felt in the trailer had traveled straight up the frame of the truck and into the cab. It was relentless. The surface of her black coffee, sitting in the cup holder next to her, was constantly rippling with concentric circles, vibrating to the exact rhythm of the crate. The rhythmic humming began to take a severe psychological toll. The sound was just at the edge of human hearing, a deep, resonant bass that caused a throbbing pressure behind Sarah's eyes. She reached out and cranked up the volume on her radio, hoping to drown out the maddening pulse with classic rock. But as she turned the dial, there was no music. Every single FM and AM station was gone. The only sound coming through the heavy cab speakers was a thick, heavy blanket of static. But as Sarah listened closer, a cold wave of absolute dread washed over her. The static on the radio was not random white noise. The static was surging and fading in perfect, synchronized rhythm, with the pulsing vibration coming from the crate. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at Sarah's throat. She reached for her cell phone, intending to call Ryan Daniels, her dispatcher, to demand he tell her exactly what she was hauling. She dialed his direct line. The call connected, but it didn't ring. There was simply dead air. "Ryan?" Sarah practically yelled into the speaker. "Ryan, are you there?" Nothing. She hung up and tried again. Dead air. She looked at her phone's display. She had full cell service. 4 bars of LTE. But no call would go through. She tried calling the main Apex Logistics hotline. Dead air. She tried dialing 911. Dead air. She was completely, utterly isolated. At 2:45 in the morning, Sarah began the most dangerous leg of the journey, the ascent into the Appalachian Mountains. The stretch of Interstate 40 that winds through the Pigeon River Gorge is notorious among truckers. It is a steep, incredibly winding highway that cuts directly through deep mountain passes, flanked by sheer rock walls on one side and deadly drop-offs on the other. As she began the climb, the weather rapidly deteriorated. The freezing rain turned into a thick, impenetrable mountain fog that swallowed the highway. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Sarah was forced to slow her massive rig down to a crawl, navigating the treacherous curves by keeping her eyes glued to the faded white line on the right side of the road. The strain on her truck was immense. The massive diesel engine roared, struggling violently to pull the shifting, impossibly heavy weight up the steep mountain grades. The temperature gauge on her dashboard began to steadily climb toward the red zone, indicating the engine was dangerously overheating in the freezing air. And the vibration from the crate was growing stronger. It was no longer just a hum. It felt like a physical force pushing against the back of her seat. The rhythmic pulsing was now so loud in the cab it sounded like heavy, muffled blows being struck against the inside of the steel crate. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. Sarah's hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Her breath was coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She was a veteran driver, tough as nails, but the sheer unnatural wrongness of the situation was breaking her down. She desperately wanted to pull over, to jump out of the truck and run away into the freezing fog, but there were no shoulders on this stretch of the mountain pass. She was trapped in the cab with whatever was in that crate. Finally, at roughly 3:30 in the morning, she reached the top of the pass and began the long, steep descent toward Asheville. According to the handwritten directions Ryan had given her, she needed to take an unmarked rural county road exit just before the city limits. She found the exit. It was barely a road, more of a jagged path of broken, crumbling asphalt that wound its way deep into a heavily forested valley, far away from the interstate. The trees hung low over the road, their bare branches scraping violently against the top of her trailer like skeletal fingers in the dark. For 10 agonizing miles, Sarah navigated this terrifying, twisting back road, the headlights of her Freightliner illuminating nothing but dense, impenetrable woods and thick fog. Finally, the trees parted, and the road ended abruptly in front of a massive, rusted iron gate. Sarah brought the truck to a halt, the air brakes hissing loudly in the dead silence of the mountain valley. She peered through the rain-streaked windshield. Beyond the gate sat the Blackwood processing facility. It was a sprawling, industrial nightmare. The massive concrete buildings looked ancient, heavily weathered, and entirely dark. There were no perimeter lights, no security cameras, no signs of human life whatsoever. The facility looked as though it had been abandoned to the elements decades ago. Thick, black ivy crawled up the sides of the crumbling concrete silos, and the massive exhaust stacks jutting into the night sky were rusted completely through. Sarah sat in her idling truck, the heavy, rhythmic thudding from the crate still echoing in her cab. She grabbed her heavy Maglite flashlight, and the pink, carbon copy manifest, unlocked her door, and stepped out into the freezing night air. The silence outside the truck was absolute. There were no crickets, no wind rustling the trees, no distant highway noise, just the heavy, wet sound of the freezing drizzle hitting the pavement. She walked up to the rusted iron gate. To her surprise, it was heavily padlocked. "Hello?" Sarah yelled, her voice sounding frail and small in the massive expanse of the dark facility. "I have a delivery from Memphis." Silence. She shook the heavy metal gate. "Hey, I'm out of hours, and I need to drop this load." Suddenly, a light flickered to life inside a small, dilapidated guard shack situated just inside the gate, a few yards away. The bulb was incredibly dim, casting a sickly, yellow pallor over the interior. The door of the guard shack slowly creaked open, and a man stepped out into the rain. Sarah aimed her heavy flashlight toward him, but the beam seemed to die out before it reached his face, as if the darkness around him was actively swallowing the light. As he walked slowly toward the gate, Sarah got a better look at him. He was an older man, dressed in a faded, heavily stained gray uniform that looked like it belonged in the 1970s. The name stitched over his left breast pocket, simply read Pendleton. He wore a hard hat that was cracked down the middle, but what struck Sarah the most was the smell. As he approached the gate, a thick, nauseating odor drifted over her. It smelled strongly of ozone, heavy industrial chemicals, and deeply charred burnt wood. The man stopped on the other side of the gate, staring at Sarah through the rusted iron bars. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow. He looked absolutely exhausted, carrying an invisible, crushing weight. "I have a delivery," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly as she held up the pink manifest through the bars. 12,000 pounds from Memphis. I need a signature." The man named Pendleton did not speak. He didn't ask for her paperwork. He simply reached through the bars with a hand that was incredibly cold and heavily scarred, and took the manifest from her trembling fingers. He pulled a heavy, silver fountain pen from his pocket. It was an incredibly archaic writing instrument, entirely out of place. He pressed the nib of the pen against the paper and, slowly and deliberately, signed his name on the receiving line. He handed the paper back to Sarah. The signature, written in deep, flowing black ink, read, "Arthur Pendleton, Facility Manager." "Where do you want it?" Sarah asked, desperate to get this transaction over with so she could flee. Arthur Pendleton pointed a single, trembling finger toward the deepest, darkest corner of the sprawling facility, where a massive set of loading bay doors sat completely open, staring out into the rain like a pitch-black, gaping maw. He didn't move to unlock the gate. He simply turned around and walked back into the suffocating darkness of the guard shack. The dim yellow light immediately clicked off, plunging the area back into absolute blackness. Sarah stood there for a moment, stunned. Then, she heard the heavy, metallic click of the padlock disengaging on its own. The massive iron gate slowly, agonizingly swung open inward, groaning loudly on rusted hinges. Sarah ran back to her truck, scrambled into the cab, and locked the doors. She threw the rig into gear and slowly pulled through the gates, navigating the crumbling, debris-strewn concrete of the facility lot toward the open bay doors Pendleton had pointed to. She backed the trailer up to the dark bay, perfectly aligning her rear doors with the dock. As she set the parking brake, she expected to see a crew of workers emerge from the darkness with a forklift to unload the terrifying crate. She waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Nothing happened. The facility remained completely, deathly silent. But then, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run absolutely cold. The heavy, rhythmic thudding from the trailer had stopped. The deep, organic vibration that had plagued her for the last 300 miles was entirely gone. The truck was perfectly still. Driven by a sudden, intense wave of panic and a desperate need to know, Sarah grabbed her flashlight, threw open her cab door, and sprinted to the back of the trailer. She grabbed the heavy metal handles of the right trailer door, unlatched it, and swung it open, shining her powerful mag light directly into the dark cavern of the 53-foot box. The beam of light cut through the dark. The heavy ratcheting straps were still firmly attached to the floor rails. They were still cranked down tight, holding the exact shape of a massive, minivan-sized object. But the thick, dark steel crate was gone. It hadn't been unloaded. There was no forklift. There was no one in the dark bay behind the truck. The massive, impossible weight that had nearly destroyed her suspension, the crate that had thudded with a terrifying heartbeat, had simply vanished into thin air from inside a locked trailer. The heavy-duty straps were perfectly taut, bowing upward over empty space, holding down absolutely nothing. Sarah didn't investigate. She didn't walk into the dark facility to look for Arthur Pendleton. She slammed the trailer door shut, latched it with shaking hands, sprinted back to her cab, and floored the accelerator. She tore out of the Blackwood processing facility, her empty trailer bouncing violently behind her, not stopping until she hit the interstate, driving recklessly fast until the sun finally broke over the horizon. At 7 o'clock on the morning of November 15th, 2018, Sarah pulled into a crowded pilot travel center outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. The parking lot was full of normal trucks, normal drivers drinking coffee, normal life. She sat in her cab, shaking uncontrollably, staring at the pink carbon copy manifest sitting on her passenger seat. The deep black ink of Arthur Pendleton's signature stared back at her. She picked up her phone and dialed Ryan Daniels, the night dispatcher at Apex Logistics. This time, the call rang through immediately. "Apex, Ryan speaking," the dispatcher answered, his voice bright and entirely normal. "Ryan," Sarah breathed, her voice cracking. "It's Sarah Jenkins. I made the drop. Blackwood processing. The crate. Ryan, something is incredibly wrong with that load. The crate vanished. The facility is abandoned." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah?" Ryan said, sounding genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? You're out of hours. You've been logged out since last night." "The load, Ryan. The ghost load out of Memphis. You called me at 11:30 last night. You told me to run paper logs. 12,000 pounds to Asheville." Sarah was screaming now, tears of pure terror welling in her eyes. "Sarah, calm down," Ryan said, his voice taking on a serious, concerned tone. "I never called you last night. I've been reviewing the logs all morning. Your ELD shows your truck has been parked at the Memphis truck stop for the last 14 hours. Your GPS ping hasn't moved an inch since yesterday afternoon." Sarah's blood froze in her veins. She pulled her iPad out of her dash mount and opened the company portal. She pulled up her truck's digital log. Ryan was right. The digital system showed a solid, unbroken line of off-duty sleeper berth status in Memphis, Tennessee. According to the federal government, Apex Logistics, and global positioning satellites, Sarah Jenkins' truck had never moved. "I drove all night," Sarah whispered, looking down at her mud-caked boots and her hands, which were trembling violently. "I have the manifest, Ryan. I have the pink copy. It's signed." "Sarah, I don't know what you're looking at, but there is no Blackwood processing facility in our system. There is no client by that name. We don't have a warehouse in Sector 4B in Memphis. I need you to get some sleep, okay? You're hallucinating from exhaustion. It happens to the best of us." Ryan hung up the phone. Sarah sat in the freezing cab, utterly paralyzed. She looked down at the manifest again. The paper was real. The heavy, tactile weight of it in her hands was undeniable. But as she stared at the signature of Arthur Pendleton, she noticed something horrifying. The deep, flowing black ink from the fountain pen was beginning to fade. It wasn't just drying. It was actively evaporating into the air, the letters dissolving into the heavy paper stock right before her eyes, leaving nothing but a faint, ghostly impression of the strokes. Driven by a desperate, maddening need for proof that she had not lost her mind, Sarah dropped her trailer at the truck stop and drove her standalone cab back into the Appalachian Mountains. She retraced her exact route, navigating the winding, unmarked county road in the harsh light of day. She found the end of the road. But there was no rusted iron gate, there was no guard shack, and there was absolutely no massive concrete industrial facility. Where the Blackwood processing facility had stood just hours before, there was nothing but a massive, overgrown, blackened scar in the earth. The area was surrounded by decades-old rusted chain-link fencing, thoroughly reclaimed by the dense mountain forest. Sarah parked her truck, climbed out, and walked up to a rusted sign hanging precariously from the fence. The faded, barely legible paint read, "Site of the Blackwood Processing Disaster. Trespassing is strictly prohibited by order of the federal government." Refusing to let the mystery consume her, Sarah drove back to Asheville and went straight to the county archives at the main public library. She spent hours scrolling through reels of microfiche from the local newspaper archives, searching for any mention of Blackwood processing. Finally, she found it. The front page of the Asheville Citizen-Times, dated October 31st, 1982. The headline, printed in massive bold letters, read, "Catastrophic fire destroys Blackwood experimental facility. Entire night shift lost." Sarah's hands shook as she read the article. The report detailed a massive, unexplained thermal event that had completely leveled the secretive government-contracted processing plant in the dead of night. The fire had burned so hot and so fast that it melted the concrete foundations. The article stated that the fire was believed to have originated in the deep storage bays, caused by the catastrophic failure of a highly classified experimental piece of machinery that the facility had just received late that evening. Witnesses from neighboring towns reported hearing a massive rhythmic thudding echoing through the valley in the hours leading up to the explosion, a sound that violently shook the foundations of their homes. But it was the final paragraph of the article that caused Sarah to physically push herself away from the microfiche machine, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The article listed the casualties. 32 men had died in the fire. The list of the deceased was led by the man who had heroically refused to evacuate, locking the main gates to prevent emergency services from entering the highly toxic, burning complex, sacrificing himself to try and manually shut down the catastrophic failure in the storage bays. The name printed in black and white was Arthur Pendleton, facility manager. Sarah Jenkins never drove a truck at night again. She immediately quit Apex Logistics, sold her slate gray Freightliner Cascadia, and took a local day job driving a dump truck in Ohio, refusing to ever run long-haul freight across state lines. She still has the pink carbon copy manifest. The ink of the signature has completely vanished, leaving the paper entirely blank. But on cold, freezing nights in late autumn, when the rain turns to ice and the fog rolls in thick, Sarah swears she can still feel a deep, rhythmic, heavy vibration echoing in the floorboards of her house, a phantom pulse from a terrifying midnight delivery that officially never happened. What an absolutely chilling ride. Sarah's story just goes to show that out on those lonely, freezing stretches of the interstate, some manifests are better left unwritten, and some deliveries belong to the ghosts. If this midnight run sent a shiver down your spine, do me a favor, hit that like button, leave a comment down below with your theories on what was really inside that pulsing crate, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss a ride with us. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and you've been watching Channel 19 Mysteries. Do you have your own unexplained story, a glitch in reality, or a creepy encounter from the road? I want to hear about it. Send your experiences to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your story might just be the next one we investigate. Until next time, keep your headlights bright, watch the tree lines, and stay safe out there.